Today, I'd like to talk about detection engineering 101. If we share the background story we have, our company is an insurance company, and we'd like to start the detection engineering program. But actually, there's a very great concept around the world, but the knowledge is actually fragmented, actually. So, and we'd like to operationalize the detection engineering program. So that is why we'd like to search on this one, and we'd like to build some sort of theoretical kind of the comprehensive kind of the framework. So to do the structured approach. This is the kind of my presentation purposes. Actually, this is a practical threat detection engineering. This is a Bible for me, but actually, in terms of the application to our operation team, we have some sort of challenges in terms of what should I do, what kind of the process we have, or what is a good detection engineering program. So that is why we consider about it, that one. So before going to the deep dive in my presentation, let me introduce myself. My name is Tomo, Cybersecurity Architect in Tokio Marine Holdings in the insurance company. I originally worked as a red teamer, but right now, blue teamer right now. So today's goal is sharing the structured approach on the detection engineering and understand how to operationalize detection engineering program. So this session, we'd like to divide this session into the three portions. First of all, we'd like to define what is a detection engineering, try to be on the same pages. And second of all, we'd like to mention about it, detection engineering process deep dive. We'd like to discuss each process one by one. And lastly, what is a successful detection engineering program? We'd like to discuss about it. And also, your feedback is greatly welcome. Let's go to the first part with what is the what is a detection engineering. Actually, there is a bunch of definition from the vendors or white papers right now, but if you search on this one, I think the Sentinel-1 definition is great, actually. So detection engineering structured approach to developing and optimizing and managing the rule, alarm, and processes to detect the threat and suspicious activity in the real time. But I think this is a kind of describe what is a detection engineering. But actually, I'd like to a little bit simplify this definition. Actually, I'd like to say that detection engineering is a systematic approach to mine the detection gap. So the detection gap is kind of with a threat actor, we have a cat and mouse game as a blue team right now. So if you see this diagram here, so actually, this is the time, and there's the capability. So both capability is increasing by time, but still we have some sort of a gap between the evasion capability, which threat actor has, and detection capability, which blue team has. So this is a detection gap we have. So in order to mine the detection gap, first of all, what we have to do is identify what is a detection gap. There's a three ways to do that, actually. First of all, this is cyber threat intel. Cyber threat intel is one of the purposes is identify the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and the procedures, as you know that. So basically, we try to understand the kind of the evasion capability or threat actor techniques. This is the first portion, actually. The second portion is the purple teaming or red teaming. Actually, this is identify the existing prevention and detection capability, which means that we understand the blue line, which is the detection capability. So by doing these two activities, we understand the gap. But we still have some sort of the missing portion, so which is we try to have a much more crystallized what is the exact detection gap. We have a concrete example. So that is why what we do is the kind of threat hunting, actually. Threat hunting, as you know, that identify the unknown threat evading the existing security mechanism. So basically, in the threat hunting, we try to understand what exact detection gap there. So once we understand the detection gap, we try to start mine the detection gap. This is detection engineering. So this is the kind of how we can describe the detection engineering. So actually, detection engineering had three characteristics, I think. This is originally proposed by Forstad principal analyst. So there are three characteristics. First one is a detection is code. So basically, we'd like to manage the detection rule as a code. So usually, we'd like to use a Yara or maybe Sigma, or if you prefer to have any product, that we can use it. The second of all, applying the software engineering processes. Actually, when we say the structured approach, we'd like to apply the software engineering. The definition on the software engineering is here came from the IEEE, but basically, we'd like to use the metrics or some sort of the structured approach to manage and evaluating the detection engineering. This is the application of the software engineering. Lastly, this is the agile approach. So because threat actors change the technique frequently, we'd like to start small and continuous improvement. This is a very important concept in the detection engineering. So if you consider if I actually search on the bunch of the detection engineering processes, actually each vendor proposed a very good concept, but I think one of the most favorite one is DRDLC, Detection and Response Development Lifecycle, proposed by Forrester's principal analyst. Actually, there's 8 steps, but very simple and easy to use it. In the next section, we'd like to deep dive into each section one by one. But we'd like to explain the detection engineering process by using this framework. OK, let's go to the next portion, which is detection engineering process deep dive. So actually, there's an 8 step here. But actually, there is no concrete description on what each phase should be. So we'd like to a little bit deep dive and consider about how to do these kind of processes. The first phases we have is actually discover. So discover means that identify detection rules that need to be created or improved. So basically, we try to understand the needs of the detection engineering. There is a 4 critical paths or 4 critical person in discover phases. First one, which is a CTI analyst, absolutely. They understand the latest technique, latest threat action activity. This is a very important input. The second person is a SOC analyst. So SOC analyst is working in the cybersecurity frontier, actually. So their insight is very valuable and helpful to build the detection engineering code. And also, SOC analysts may be faced on the purple teaming and threat hunting. This feedback is also very beneficial on the input on the discover phases. Thirdly, which is security policy. The security policy is basically based on the business's requirement or security requirement. We have additional control for the security environment. For example, we'd like to prohibit some specific services in the company because of the corporate policy. This is another way, another pass on this one. And lastly, which is the monitoring phases, which is the monitoring phase is actually the last phases here. But monitoring phases basically evaluate the quality on the detection rule. So based on the evaluation, we'd like to input another additional requirement to do this. So actually, this process is kind of the iterative cycle on this one. And nextly, by understanding the needs, what we try to do is define phases. So define phases, we try to describe the requirement on the detection rule, basically requirement definition. There are 2 activities we have, basically requirement definition, detection requirement definition, and second of all, triage or prioritization. Let's look at one by one. The detection requirement definition is basically, we'd like to understand what is a requirement on the detection rule. So basically, we'd like to understand, so same as the software engineering, we'd like to define the requirements. So there's a bunch of the way to describe the requirements, but we usually point out the 6th point, which is called the rescue framework. So basically, who is the requester? What is the exact reason why we create the rule? So we'd like to mention about it, the evidence. As also, we'd like to define the scoping. Maybe this the rule is temporary. It's kind of iterative processes. Also, we'd like to define the exact content is, also urgency. So the reason why we'd like to understand the urgency needs, the reason why this rule is very important. Lastly, the exception. For example, as I mentioned about it, sometimes detection engineering process is started by security requirement or security policy. But some tools is, for example, it's legitimate purposes for some specific business domain, but some other is not. So we'd like to understand what is the exception on this one. So we'd like to define like kind of 6 phases. And nextly, we'd like to do the prioritization. So this depends on the size of your company or size of the organization. So if you have a lot of the detection engineer, it's fine. But usually the detection engineer resources very limited or very variable. So we like to do some sort of prioritization on this one. And sometimes we like to, of course, consider the stability, but sometimes consider about the coverage on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, for example. But anyway, we'd like to define the prioritization on this one. Once we finish the define phases, we go to the building phases, actual implementation. So we need to have a design and development phases. Actually, in the design phase, usually detection engineer has further research on this one. We understand the necessary component to create a detection code. First of all, we need to understand what is the source of the detection, actually. So without the visibility, actually, we cannot detect it. So that's why we need to understand what kind of log source we are necessary and whether or not we have. And then we need to also consider about the logic, and also we need to consider the condition when we trigger these logics. We need to understand these components, and also we try to convert the requirement definition into the technical specification. So I'd like to propose the kind of a whole framework in the next pages, but we try to define the technical specification on this one. And lastly, we try to define the validation criteria. In the next phases, actually we have a test phases here. So in the test phases, how to assure the quality of the detection codes. So we'd like to define the validation criteria. We'd like to explain that later, but we'd like to define in the design phases. And I mentioned about it, the whole framework. So basically, when we try to write down the technical specification, at least we'd like to include the 4 portions, actually. First of all, hypothesis is what is the kind of the objective on the detection code. For example, this is a very simple cases. Threat actor create a suspicious domain account, for example. This is the kind of a statement. And then after define the goal, we'd like to define the objective of the object of the investigation. So basically, we'd like to, for example, in these cases, we'd like to search on the event log. And nextly, we'd like to define the procedures. So procedure means, for example, filter on the event ID, for example, and we'd like to identify the log record when help desk closes, for example. And lastly, we'd like to define the evaluation criteria. So if we found out the record, how do you judge on that kind of a detection? We'd like to define the evaluation criteria. Then, after doing the designing, actual implementation or development is happened. So basically, we'd like to use the Sigma, or sometimes use the Yara. If you use the Splunk, SPO is one of the choices. If you use the preferable security telemetry, you can use these kind of the code. Nextly, we'd like to do the testing phases. So testing phases is basically, so we'd like to test whether or not detection rule function works as expected. So basically, we prepared the 2 data, actually, known good and known bad. So basically, both purposes is confirming the false positive and false positive, whether or not there's a no false positive or no false negative. We try to validate on this portion, actually. Once this is finished, then we try to start the releasing and deliver. phases. So usually it depends on the company actually, but we'd like to review and approve the kind of created detection rule, and also we'd like to have some sort of documentation. We store the detection rule in the appropriate repository, and we'd like to deploy the GIS rule to the environments. So this is the phase 5 and phase 6. And actually, if you search on the detection engineering in the internet, many documents recommended to do the CI/CD, apply to the CI/CD pipeline. Definitely, I agree on this one. But I think it depends on the size, sizes and maturity. If your company started the detection engineering and this is the initial phases, maybe manual work is fine. But once your process is matured, I think that we definitely recommend to do some sort of CI/CD pipeline to do the automation and decrease the workload on the detection engineer. Once this is finished, what we try to do is learning the code. But learning the code is fine, but one of the important points is we'd like to consider about deployment tag. So actually, when we create that detection code, the quality or maturity on the code is actually diverse. Sometimes the code is very experimental. So in these cases, maybe only limited people review on this one. But if you're much more testing phases, maybe increasing the person to review it. If this is stable, every SOC analyst will review on this one. So basically, this deployment tag design or kind of announce the commitment on the SOC analysis. So basically, if the experimental, maybe a little bit difficult to give I'd like to avoid the workload, maybe only 1 or 2% to review on this one. So we'd like to categorize the code, and we'd like to assign the commitment level. So this is the important portion on the run phases. Lastly, this is the monitor phases. So monitor phases is basically manage and accuracy and quality of the detection code based on the KPI or functional metrics. We actually recommend to use the 3M plus C framework. This is originally conceptualized by practical threat detection engineering, but we did a little bit add on the couple dimension portion. Actually, 3M plus C stands for metrics, monitoring and maintenance, and continuous validation. I'd like to touch on the one by one. First one, which is metrics. So metrics is kind of the top-down approach and evaluate the detection rule performances by statistical KPI. For example, the number of the detection alerts or number of the alert result or number of the false positive, for example, or average time to close it, or standard deviation of the time to close it. There is a bunch of the KPI we have actually. So for example, analysis result. So if you have 100 alerts, but 100 alerts is going to the false positive, it might be the rule is not good. Or maybe we have some sort of a need to improve the rule actually. This is one portion. For example, other one is average time to close. So if you close some specific detection, if you close the alerts, the time is very, if SOC analysts spend a lot of the time, which means that alert or detection code only give the limited information to the SOC analyst. So that is why SOC analysts try to do the additional analysis onto whether or not this is the false positive. Maybe we have some sort of room to improve it. Or other one is a standard deviation, for example. Standard deviation is a variety of the time, actually. Maybe if some person, A, closes very quickly, but other person takes a time, maybe the procedure or analysis way is not standardized. So we understand, by using these kind of methods, we understand the behavior of the SOC analysis, and we like to improve these kind of the quality on the code. This is the first portion we have. The second portion we have, which is the monitoring. This is on the contrary, this is a much more bottom-up approach. So basically, detection engineer analyze the detection rule, especially focus on the false positive. So the reason, so we try to analyze the reason why the false positives happen. We try to understand the code, the reason this is a false positive, and then based on this one, we try to improve the code. This is a much of bottom-up approach. Nextly, which is the maintenance. As I mentioned about it, detection engineering processes is agile approach. What does it mean is that we try to start small and continuous improvement. Maybe when we start to write down the detection code, maybe you only have the IP address or the CSSP communication. Maybe you only have a empty hash value on the malware, for example. But if you search on the external threat intel, you might be improve the detection code. Or if you analyze the malware more deeply, for example, using the code analysis, for example, or reverse engineering, you get further information on this one. Or maybe you analyze the similar malware is also one of the way. So basically, the concept on the maintenance way is try to improve the code by using the external code or deeper analysis. So this is the way to improve on the code. Lastly, which is the continuous validation. So continuous validation is basically this is the purple teaming or red teaming. We try to do the red teaming operation or purple teaming operation, and we try to confirm whether or not this attack is detected. But I think a very important point is we try to use the atomic purple teaming concept. So basically, if you do the whole entire red teaming, it is very time consuming, and we need the preparation. But we try to pick up the specific technique, and we try to validate it. So actually, we try to also define some of the, what kind of the components should be defined in the when we create the purple team, in the continuous validation actually. But actually, the concept is we try to do the purple teaming, especially atomic purple teaming, and we try to validate this one. This is the entire process. There's an 8-step for the detection engineering. So lastly, I'd like to a little bit talk about a successful detection engineering program. So when we say the successful detection engineering program, there's a 3 critical KPIs available, which is MTTD and MTTR, and precision and recall and detection coverage. So MTTD and MTTR, we'd like to explain that later, but this is the viewpoint of the time. The precision and recall is the efficiency, and detection coverage is a coverage. We'd like to touch on the one by one. First one, which is MTTD and MTTR, which stands for the mean time detect and mean time response. Basically, this is the average time to do the detection, average time on the response. So actually, the background story or theory is a time-based story, which is proposed in 1999, but it's still workable. And actually, it said that if the MTTD and MTTR is smaller than mean time attack, this is your system is secure. So basically, this is the idea on this one. So the detection engineering is definitely contribute to decrease the amount of the mean time detect and mean time response. So this is a very important KPI to evaluate whether or not your detection program, engineering program is successful. This is the first KPI we have. Second KPI is a precision and recall. I have actually a PhD degree on the engineering, but I have an allergy on the mathematics, but I don't want to talk about mathematics. But basically, this concept is we need to understand the false positive ratio and understand false negative ratio. So we like to use this kind of a KPI to evaluate the efficiency on the detection engineering. This is the second portion we have. Lastly, which is the detection coverages. So as the kind of the detection engineer or a blue team side, we try to cover the detection as much as possible in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. But one of the caveats we have in the reality, covering everything is impossible, actually. We need a prioritization. So that is why threat intel is a very important, or threat profiling on the attacker is a very important. So you understand kind of what kind of threat actor we have, and we'd like to cover the attack as much as possible. So we need a still prioritization, but there's an important concept in detection coverages. So in the last section, I had talked about it, 3M+C framework, which is metrics, monitoring, maintenance, and continuing evaluation. This four concept is very closely related to the three critical KPI, as I mentioned in the MTTD, or precision, recall, and detection coverage. Let me explain a little bit. For example, if you pick up the monitoring is basically examining the false positive alerts. So this is a very bottom-up approach, and also we'd like to have an activity after getting the alert, which means that reactive. And also the evidence, from the evidence perspective, this is a much more qualitative approach, actually. But also this is a contribute to the precision improvement, actually. But if you consider about the maintenance, which is kind of using the threat into or applying the deeper analysis on the malware, which is also the bottom-up, but this is a much more proactive and much more quantitative. And also this is improve the recall portion, which means that we'd like to improve the false negative ratio, actually. And also improve the detection coverage. And for the other example is a continuous validation. This is a much more top-down approach. It's a very proactive and also quantitative. And this improves the mean time detect, mean time response. It also improve the recall, which is the decrease of false negative, and also detection coverage. The point is, we introduced a 3M+C framework, but this component has a different functionality to improve the KPI. So we'd like to use the combination of each technique for improve the detection engineering entirely. This is a very important portion. And lastly, I'd like to a little bit talk about what is how to expand the detection capability. Actually, there is a three way to do that, actually, which is extension, sophistication, and abstraction. So extension, which means that this is much more, extend the detection capability to similar attack method or tools. For example, if you have one or two specific IP addresses for the detection perspective, and if you get some sort of threat intel, you try to add it to the additional IP addresses or hash value. This is kind of extension on the same layers. The other one, which is the sophistication. So, I thought I mentioned about the extension. Extension is much more kind of using the early stages. And the sophistication is nextly, and sophistication is much more deep dive analysis, and we like to add it. In the initial phases, you maybe only get a hash value or maybe IP addresses. But if you have a deeper analysis on the malware, you have additional information, or maybe threat intel gives additional information. We'd like to have a much more sophisticated detection rule as much as possible. This is the second layer we have. Lastly, which is the generalized detection, which is the abstraction. Actually, this is a great idea from the Mitra Corporation submitting the pyramid. This is a kind of a great concept. And if you're not familiar with the submitting the pyramid, I definitely recommend to check it. But actually, basically, we'd like to generalize the detection. We'd like to cover the detection as much as possible. There is a three way to do that. But actually, abstraction is the most powerful, but it takes a time. So also, we need a effort. So that is why we like to utilize in the operation level, we like to utilize the three way to improve the detection code. Lastly, we just quickly wrap up my presentation. First of all, I'd like to talk about what is a detection engineering. I'd like to say that this is a systematic approach to mine the detection gap. So And also, there's a 3 characteristics like a detection net code or a structured approach with the software engineering. And I also introduced the detection engineering processes. And nextly, we'd like to deep dive into the detection engineering processes. There's an 8 step, and there's a couple of ways to operationalize these activity. And lastly, we'd like to talk about what is a successful detection engineering program. We introduced the 3 high-level KPI, and this is the kind of the way to improve it. And also, we'd like to mention about it 3 strategy to further implement. I hope this presentation helps your organization, and thank you very much for listening.
Is there any question for Tomo? Yes. We have time for 2 or 3. Go ahead. I think that they are on.
Oh.
Jesse.
Hi, thank you for the talk. When you're in the test phase of your rules, are you testing to make sure that they're valid rules, or are you testing the quality of them to see if they generate false positives?
Yeah, well, first of all, we try to test in the kind of whether or not the false positive, actually. So I think the little bit in the testing phase, a little bit difficult to make completely assure the kind of the stuff. So that's why we did first of all check the, first of all, at least the quality, and also whether at least there's no quick false positive. And we try to improve this quality in the monitor phases. What we try, this is the way to do that.
When you're testing the quality, is that an automated process? And what kind of tests are you using to test the quality?
Still we have an initial phase right now. We still a little bit have a manual process right now, but we'd like to try to improve the automation. Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It's clearly that it is a framework, I mean, a systematic approach. Have you thought of using AI to automate some kind of these processes, like, I mean, prioritizing or repetitive tasks or expanding the capability of the detection? So have you thought of any, I mean, type of AI tools that can help this process to facilitate the steps?
Thank you very much. Actually, we need to do some sort of the POC, proof of the concept on this one, but actually, ideally, if you have a strategy to convert to create a sigma is perfect, it's good. But actually, in my testing, still we have some sort of the improvement actually. So still try to working on this one, yeah, right now. But if you have any recommendation, it's greatly helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Another question. We have time for one more. Otherwise, I ask another big applause for Tomo. Thank you so much.